The speaker tonight is somebody, they say, doesn't need an introduction. Your introduction would be so long we would be here for all night, John. John has been probably one of the most interesting and important public servants in Northern Ireland for the last 20 years, 30 years, having been a doctor as well in some of the most complex situations before that, and having been a member of the church really for the whole of that time and seen that as part of his life. So we are very honoured to have somebody who has both represented but also thought and lived alongside the community here on these topics. I think, again, you're onto a topic, loneliness and friendship, which is really one of these topics which doesn't really get raised by the social scientists, but actually gets met by people who work in communities. So sometimes I think these are the topics which actually matter. But we're really, really honoured to have you, John. So thank you very much indeed, and we just look forward to what you have to say.
Duncan, thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here. I've got to now manage a microphone, a slide mover, and my sheets. So I mean, I'm not great at multitasking at the best of times, but let's hope that this works out. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here to share on what is becoming more and more of a current issue that people are talking about. I mean, it's popping up in the BBC on a regular basis now. So I'm delighted to have the chance to talk about it. And I suppose what I'm talking about, it is based on a paper that Deborah Miller, Sonia McGee, and myself did just over 2 years ago. We posted it in February 2021. So things have moved on a bit in the past 2 years, and I'm sort of trying to develop some of the stuff in the paper a bit and share with you. Last September, a partially decomposed body was found in a hammock covered by macaw feathers in the depths of the Amazonian rainforest. And this body belongs to the sole surviving, or the sole remaining member of a tribe from the Amazonian rainforest. And the tribe had suffered genocide. And in fact, the 5 last companions that he had were shot by illegal miners in 1996. And so from 1996, he had lived alone in the Amazonian rainforest without human contact for 26 years. And then his body was subsequently found. So when he died, his tribal language died, his tribal customs and, I suppose, spoken history died, and that was the end of that tribe. Now, I suppose, the poignancy of that story is increased when we realize that actually loneliness. He was labelled the loneliest man in the world by the press when reports of his death came out. This was the loneliest man in the world has died. But loneliness has become really a worldwide phenomenon. It's just spread across the globe. People speak of the loneliness epidemic. Norina Hertz, who's an economist, an academic, and a writer, has said loneliness had become one of the defining emotions of the 21st century, even before COVID struck. And COVID has, as we all know, made it worse. So why don't we start with a definition? Because there can be, people talk about loneliness, about social isolation, about solitude. But loneliness is a distressing feeling that accompanies the perception that one's social needs are not being met by the quantity or especially the quality of one's social relationships. So people experience loneliness because what they are needing or looking for in terms of social connection isn't being met. Now, social isolation is a lack of social contacts. But some people don't mind very few social contacts. Some people can be socially isolated but not feeling lonely. Whereas solitude is a spiritual discipline. Solitude is something that people choose to seek. It's a life-enriching practice of choice. But loneliness is the exact opposite. And loneliness is certainly not life-enriching. It is the opposite to that. We all feel lonely from time to time. So it is a universal human experience. To feel lonely is to be human. But it is increasing. There are thousands of statistics floating around these days regarding loneliness, but I want to just pick out 4. First of all, loneliness has increased in Western Europe by 50% in the past 10 years. And that, I think those figures are pre-COVID, by the way. So it has increased from there. Secondly, according to Age UK, there are almost 1.5 million older people often feel lonely. Of those, 500,000 older people in Britain go at least 5 or 6 days a week without seeing or speaking to anyone. And that's their normal lived experience. And 2/5 of older people say that their TV is their main company. So I think that reflects the sort of poverty of relationship that exists today, certainly in the UK and Ireland and in North America. Perhaps the most surprising, if not shocking, statistic is that in 2018 the BBC did a survey of 55,000 adults, and they found that the 16 to 24-year-olds, the Gen Zs, as the Americans call them, or Gen Zs, as we call them, in their survey, 40% of Gen Zs said that they felt lonely often or very often. 40% of 16 to 24-year-olds feel lonely often or very often. So that, in fact, is the highest prevalence among all age groups. So we're going to come back to that before we finish tonight. And as we know, the COVID epidemic simply made things worse. People became more isolated and more frightened to reach out, felt more threatened in social situations, and so they socially withdrew. Now, part of the difficulty is that loneliness. Well, as they say, peace and quiet. I'd give anything for a bit of peace and quiet, but it turns out that too much peace and quiet is not good for you. In fact, it can damage your health. So loneliness has significant health impacts. First of all, they say that loneliness is the impact on your health is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and we all know how serious that is. It leads to obesity. I suppose that's very understandable. People comfort eat. But when you become obese, then you're more susceptible to type 2 diabetes, so that's commoner in people who are lonely. It has serious implications for cardiovascular disease. So angina, ischemic heart disease, high blood pressure, strokes are all common in people who feel lonely. It has a negative effect on your immune system, so you become more susceptible to infection. And it's associated with early death. So people who live on their own are more likely to die than people who live with company. Before we move on to the mental health, let's just move on. So, mental health impacts. Loneliness is strongly associated with depression, which is, I suppose we'd all expect that, really, wouldn't we? But it also causes people's cognitive functions to deteriorate. So their capacity to think clearly deteriorates. There's an increased incidence. Your likelihood of getting Alzheimer's disease is doubled. But it also leads to anxiety, fear, low self-esteem. People feel unsafe, feel vulnerable, feel anxious, feel angry. And then a certain vicious circle develops where people's capacity to interpret social cues is affected. And so they become oversensitive and they misread people, and they pick up negative vibes from people when there may not be any negative vibes, or they overreact to something that may be construed as a mild criticism. And that makes them more insecure. Their social skills deteriorate further. They become more isolated. They become frightened to reach out because going into social situations becomes a negative experience for them. And so this sort of spiral downwards happens in people, therefore, because they're depressed, because they're anxious, because they're fearful, because they're misreading people, they feel bad about themselves, their self-esteem deteriorates, and they think, I'm not going to go into those situations. I'll only feel worse for doing that. The longest running research study into human flourishing, the Harvard study on adult development, it's been going for 85 years. It began with it began in 1937. They took 268 Harvard undergraduates. So these are the cream, really, of the crop. Then they paired them with young men from very disadvantaged backgrounds in Massachusetts, and they've studied them over the subsequent 85 years, taken thousands of measurements, bloods, brain scans, interviews, questionnaires, to really look and see what's the secret to a happy life, and what causes, what contributes to human flourishing, and what detracts from human flourishing. And the interesting thing is that the one persistent, significant finding that emerged above all else was that relationships keep us happier and healthier throughout our life. So over all the hundreds of thousands of assessments that have been done, the primary conclusion from the Harvard study, and it wasn't to do with education, wealth, marriage, or anything like that. It was that relationships keep us healthier and happier throughout our life. And those can be relationships with spouse, friends, relatives, workmates. They're all important. In fact, everyone needs one or two close relationships in order to flourish emotionally. We all need a supportive, trusted, close relationship. Someone with whom we can be ourselves, someone with whom we can confide, someone who knows our strengths and our weaknesses, someone who knows what we're like, we're seen as on bad days, someone who knows our failures, but still remain a loyal friend to us. And those relationships have a huge influence on our life experience, on our sense of well-being, on our sense of self-esteem, on our levels of happiness. Okay, let me then go from that to, let me go back one first of all. Okay. I suppose the question then is, at least what I'd like us to say, well, given that this is the culture that we live in, the prevailing social climate that exists here in Western Europe, in North America, how should the church respond? Well, first of all, it should come as no surprise to us that this is the environment that we're living in, because it's become more and more obvious over the past decade. I think we all know that we were made to belong. We're social creatures. We need to be socially connected. We're not designed to live as atomized individuals. The very nature of being human means that we are interdependent, that other people are necessary in order for us to be who we would like to be, that everyone needs to belong. Let me just then try and inject this into the biblical narrative. They say that we're all part of a story. And let me just talk us through, and for those of you who are theologians, please bear with me as I do this. But I think this is important, because if we're to see how, as a church, we're to respond, then we need to understand what the scriptures say about loneliness. So God begins in Genesis by saying, "Let us make mankind in our image and our likeness." So that was a corporate act of creation by a triune God, creating man and woman to be in relationship with him and with each other, and to have dominion over creation as a joint enterprise. So that's how the story starts. So right from the very start, it's a story that involves relationship. The relational nature of human existence was emphasized when God said explicitly, "It's not good for man to be alone." But then, as we know, sin destroyed the purity of these relationships, resulting in separation from God and from each other. Life circumstances, misadventure, illness, rejection, and many other life experiences can add to the isolation and loneliness that people experience. But the work of the cross, Jesus' death and resurrection, directly addressed the alienation and isolation caused by sin, reconciling us to God through the miracle of the new creation and entrusting to us the ministry of reconciliation. So this whole issue of loneliness, of people living in the midst of fractured relationships, is central to the whole message of salvation and of new creation. So to be reconciled to God is to be born again into a loving family, a supportive community. The defining characteristics of the early Christians, as Jesus said, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, by the love you have for one another," that you love one another. So loving relationships are at the heart of God's purpose for the church. The dislocation and distrust and division that arose from the Tower of Babel contrasted with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, when language no longer divided, confused, and alienated nations and races. But it initiated a new era, giving rise to a joyful new community of believers. So people there from all nations, or at least many of the known nations, heard the disciples speaking in their own language. And out of that grew a community, and a very diverse community of believers. The new community, the church, has been entrusted with a message of reconciliation and friendship, and has been commissioned and empowered to love. So for us as the church, our church mission directly addresses this issue of loneliness. Okay. So I suppose what I'd say is that mission has never been more relevant than it is today. In a world that's anxious, fractured, increasing numbers living alone, and with increasing numbers of who are friendless. And it's worth saying that this in particular is a problem for men. So 1 in 3 men say that they have no close friends. Isn't that shocking? 1 in 3 men. have no close friend. Report having no close friends. Young men, I mean, we know that the problems that young men have, the increasing rates of suicide, problem gambling, addiction, alcohol, drugs, pornography. So there is a crisis among young men today, and it is reflected in the growing levels of self-harm. Much of the social infrastructure that enabled men to have a group of friends or a group of mates has been eroded. The nature of work has changed. People work more often on their own than within a band of brothers. Social clubs there are far fewer social clubs now than there used to be. Certainly in East Belfast, I don't know if it was a good thing, but there used to be loads and loads of social clubs where people would go to drink. But now it's cheaper and easier to go with the blue bag brigade, as we talk about, go and buy 24 cans of beer and go home and watch Netflix. And so maybe social clubs, drinking clubs, had certain negative health impacts, but they brought people together. I think that, I suppose what I'd like to say is that as a church, I think that we need to look again at this issue of male bonding, of brotherhood. I mean, it's interesting that in the biblical narrative, there are some fascinating examples of friendship between men. I mean, David and Jonathan is an obvious one. Jesus and his disciples is John, the 3, the 12, the 60, whatever. You know, it was clearly a very relational environment that existed there. I think the letter to Philemon is just full of relational elements, echoes, perspectives. Paul's relationship with Philemon and with Onesimus, and you know, all that he says within that letter reflects a really rich relational matrix. So I think today male bonding or brotherhood is under pressure. I don't want to exaggerate things, but it is under pressure. And I think for us as a church, we need to be looking again at this. So how should the church respond to this this situation that we find ourselves in? Okay. The new community of the church has been entrusted with a message of reconciliation and friendship, and has been commissioned and empowered to love. So I do believe that the church uniquely is equipped to speak into this whole issue of loneliness. First of all, God has reached out to each of us to befriend us in a profound way. Okay, the whole message of the gospel is that God has come to us to know us and to make himself known. And that directly addresses the existential loneliness that so many people are feeling and experiencing. Secondly, he welcomes us into a family. You know, it's no longer it's not a case of you in your small corner and I in mine. It's a matter of being adopted into God's family. It's a matter of being born again into a company of believers. The local expression being the local church. And furthermore, as we are born into a company of believers, we both receive and give. We have a role to play, a contribution to make. And for many people, part of loneliness comes from a feeling of uselessness, of purposelessness, of not having anything that they can do that would make a difference. You know, they sit at home, they watch TV, but they're not making any contribution to the sum of human goodness and well-being. And we all need some sort of sense of purpose. We all need to be able to contribute, to give. Give and you shall receive. It is more blessed to give than to receive. There is a need within each of us to be able to give and to give in a way that makes a difference to other people. So we're part. So furthermore, we can do that. The opportunities that God presents to us are that we can do it within the community of believers, the community of faith, but we can also do that within the community in the area in which we live. And I think that double-sided role is really important for us to see. And I think increasingly that is becoming the norm, certainly here in Northern Ireland. I was in a meeting last week with a group of ladies who would be community workers within Loyalist communities, and they were saying that 15 years ago, Loyalists had a very negative view of churches. They saw churches as being detached, disinterested, uncaring, rather snobbish. But they were saying, just like we were saying, actually that's changed. Almost every church on the Shankill Road is involved in the local community, is reaching out. So churches have reorientated and realized that actually they can make a significant difference. We can't solve all the problems. I mean, that's a matter for politicians who have been so successful at it. But we can make a difference. Okay, let me just run through these. So one of the things about loneliness is that we don't have to provide wraparound care that meets all a person's needs. The thing is that simple acts of kindness, gestures, can make a difference to someone who is lonely or isolated. Small gestures, greeting, saying hello, smiling, listening, expressing thanks, phoning someone, sending a text message, handwritten letters, prayers, emails, practical support, invitations to a meal. All of those things foster a culture of welcome, of belonging, of inclusion, and small acts can make significant difference in individuals' lives. Secondly, churches are experts at group activities. Every church has got loads of groups in it. Home groups, service groups, welcome teams, PA teams, music teams, mums and tots groups, pensioners' lunches, armchair aerobics, Pilates, walking groups, youth groups, children's groups, cycling groups, CAP teams, to name just a few. But every church, if you think about it, has actually got lots of teams. And inviting someone to be a part of a team is a way to really include them and begin to address their loneliness. So we are the experts when it comes to small groups, actually, in churches. Volunteering. In the community around us, the community organisations that are there, the ones I know best are in East Belfast, and there are some really, really good community organisations there. But I'll tell you, 80% of the work that is done in each of them is done by volunteers. They may have one or two, maybe 3 paid workers, but the vast majority of people involved are there volunteering. And they're always looking for volunteers. And those community groups do make a difference to lonely people in the area. They often know where the isolated elderly are, where the people who have no friends are. And they can be, and they'll go out and they'll do Christmas gifts. They'll do Christmas hampers. They'll do little Easter events. And by volunteering for those community organizations, I think that's a brilliant way for Christians to begin to express the love of God, reach out a hand of friendship, make a difference in a person's life. And if you're a church member and you think, I would love to, you're sort of thinking, I'd like to get to know some folks in this area a bit better. Or maybe, serve the Lord by befriending someone in the area. Those community organizations are a great way to do it. Volunteer in a food bank. Great way to meet people and to make a difference in people's lives. And finally, a faithful presence in the neighbourhood. When I lived in London, Ichthus, Roger Foster's church, that Graham Kendrick was a part of, where March for Jesus came from, Ichthus was a really vibrant church down in southeast London. And when it was there, the price of houses went up, the level of crime went down, the amount of interaction within the local community increased. People felt safer. And it was because of the church was there. They were getting to know people. People felt that they were known, that people knew them, that people were saying hello to them. Whether or not they were members of the church was irrelevant. It changed the atmosphere in the area where they were living. The church, I know that in CFC Belmont, the traders on the Belmont Road really like Christian Fellowship Church because they spend money there, but because they get to know them. And so what you're doing is you're building social capital. You're creating friendships, even if you're not evangelizing people, and especially if you're not evangelizing people, especially if you're just there to be a friend. That again, it just makes people feel safe and known and recognized. So churches bring stability and bring an ethos of friendship to a community if they're functioning. Now, I know that churches are I know some churches are imperfect, but they do make a difference to the communities in which they live. So I'm going to stop there and ask you to consider two questions, because yes, they're on a sheet there. So I'd like to stop there. But I'm sure there's not very much in what I've said that's been new to you, but I've sort of just tried to put it together to say, look, we have a real problem. It is increasing. It is widespread. It is often hidden. But actually, within the church, in the mission that God's called us to, the message that He's given us, the places where we live, they have something to say that is really relevant to this whole issue of the epidemic of loneliness, or the scourge of loneliness. So the two questions that I would like you to chat about. Yeah, let me just say one other thing, and before I finish, and it's this: that churches have developed a lot of very valuable teaching courses. Now you can get teaching on prayer, teaching on evangelism, teaching on how to handle your finances, marriage preparation courses, teaching on health, how to live a healthy life. But do you know what you hardly ever hear is a teaching course on friendship, how to make friends. And actually, probably most of us have got a reasonable idea. But actually, as someone said to me a couple of days ago, you fall in love, but you make friends. And sometimes we need to be intentional, especially within church, to make friends, to invest in friendships. And sometimes there are people that you really love, and you love being with them because you leave them feeling a whole lot better. But sometimes there are people who are a bit more work, and you sometimes feel and think you're something with them for a couple of hours. Think, I'm going to have to go and lie down here in a darkened room, But even those relationships can be enriching for both people, and they can be really important for both people. So relationships are life enhancing, enriching, and they add to our sense of purpose and well-being. So I do think in our churches we have sort of assumed that everybody knows how to be friends, but particularly young people these days they've lost the skills of making friends because they relate through their devices. And I think that we need to think again, and again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. I think with men in churches, we need to rediscover what it is to be brothers and to be comfortable together. I know some men do it naturally. You go off, cycle together, and go off on holidays together, and that's wonderful. But I think those are a minority of men who do that. And I think that we need to rediscover that and discover the richness and the fun, and also how we can call one another on in terms of our faith, in terms of our daily lives, in terms of the roles that God has given us. But let me finish that with that, and then say let's take 15 minutes. To 8 o'clock. Okay, 20 minutes. What new initiatives could you take as an individual or church to reach out to lonely people in your community or town? Now, I know that probably all of you are in a church that's doing something. But could we give some thought to is there something new or fresh, even if we don't do it this week? Is there something there, a thought that could germinate and possibly in a few months' time or in a year's time we could look at doing? What new initiatives could you take? And what could your church do to promote and facilitate better friendships among men? They say that women relate face to face and men relate shoulder to shoulder, side by side. But there are initiatives. But let's think: what initiatives could our church take to foster healthy friendships between men? Okay, let's take a break there.
All right. Okay. Well, look, let me start, first of all, by thanking you, John, and I really mean that. And I think what we'll try and do this time, differently from some of the other events we've had here in the university, we'll try and have a bit of intelligent conversation amongst ourselves. But before we get there, does anybody want to ask John on any particular topic or phrase that he mentioned? And if so, put up your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you, because we do want you to have the opportunity to pick up on what he specifically said. Oh, and by the way, introduce yourself, because we are friends.
Okay, I'm Helen. John, I suppose I'm intrigued, thinking of young people as kind of why I'm here tonight. And I suppose I'm wondering, you talked a lot about how loneliness is impacting young people. Do you see it impacting their development? Is it, I know you touched on the mental health side of things, but I'm just wondering, in those key years, childhood, adolescence, is this a factor that is actually changing them?
Yeah, yes, Helen. We are going to run a video clip after this, directly addressing that issue. But yes, I think it is having very significant effect on their social development. And I mean, COVID was so difficult for the sort of 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, where they're learning to relate, and they're hanging out together, and they're messing around together, and they're learning how to negotiate and how to deal with disagreements and fallouts, etc. And I think because there wasn't the opportunity with COVID, I think a lot of young people lost ground significantly. And I think with the preoccupation now with devices digital devices, where they're relating now virtually and not in the same room. I think that has become a real problem, and I think that I think it's more or less accepted now by most people that the effect of social media has been there are benefits to it, but there are significant downsides to that, and that's contributed to young people's difficulty in relating, being confident in relating, in having healthy self-esteem, developing resilience, and those things have all I think been affected by are affecting our young people, our teens and their early 20s.
Well, let me pick up on that, and maybe we can have a wee bit of a conversation if folks want to contribute in this one. What do we do in the church about that? I mean, we can't stop them having devices. We wouldn't want to stop them. So what is your big idea for helping them not to be dependent on devices and relate better to each other?
Well, can I be a politician and say that I'll answer that question after the video clip?
Okay. Right. We'll give you a bye ball.
Yeah, because he does address that, actually.
All right. Well, then we'll bring the video forward a few minutes so that we can have a bit of conversation around that. Okay. Anything else that folks want to ask on the back of what John said earlier? John.
Given your background as a GP and your work with the PUP, right, and you're closer to loyalist working class people than most of us, do you see anything significant in a loyalist band?
In a loyalist band?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely I do. Yes. And I think, loyalist bands, well, Dan Gordon did a couple of really interesting things with bands. But it does give young men a group to belong to, a sense of identity. It requires discipline from them. They've got to learn, a musical instrument or drums. They've got to turn up for practices. They've got to learn to march. They've got to get their gear and look after their gear. So I think that there are real cultural pluses or social pluses within loyalist bands, and then people get recruited in it, and then they get old enough and then they move on out. But they're in it for a number of years, and I think that is a formative influence. And there are good bands and there are bands that are maybe not so good. And it depends who the personnel are involved. But some of them are really, expect their young men to turn up, to learn their instruments, to be disciplined, to behave themselves, and to be part of this band of brothers. I think they, although they're much criticised and sometimes their behaviour the criticism is justified, I think that they offer something positive for young men from loyalist background.
Stephen, David.
Thanks, John. You made a comment about, I think it was, if I heard you right, 10 years or so ago, someone in the community had said to you that then the churches had little or no interest or impact in the community, but that seemed to have changed. Can you elaborate on that or give us some evidence of that?
Okay, yeah, but perhaps more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, at least, loyalists often dismissed the churches as irrelevant. They're not interested in them. When it came to funerals, they'd wait outside until the coffin came out, and then they'd join the entourage after it. So they didn't have very much contact, and they viewed the churches as the churches are for those people that go to the church. And sometimes the people who came to the church were middle class people coming to a church in a working class area. Now, I think that has definitely changed. I think there are a number of churches that have got a very good track record when it comes to working in the community. They have got employed people who would run mothers and toddlers groups, breakfast clubs. The CAP organisation, serves people in the local community. When it comes to funding, churches and church organisations that work in partnership with community groups, the churches are seen as a safe pair of hands. So if funders are looking to give money, and sometimes it's considerable sums of money, sometimes it can be 30 or 40 or 50,000 pounds. The fact that a church is involved, strengthens the case for them to be given that, because the church are seen as responsible players in it.
I think for me, in terms of the churches, the social awareness of the churches has grown over the years, and there are more churches now who are satisfied to serve the community rather than reach out and try to get the community to come to the church. I think that's been a shift. So there's more social awareness around churches. On the band thing, I fully agree with you, because I know a couple of musicians who moved into the Shankill solely to work with young people in bands.
Okay. Any other questions on bits of what John said? Okay. Any wisdom then that came out of your group on either of the questions or on something related to it? So if there is wisdom, let's have it.
We had, I think, a very interesting and informed and intelligent, wise conversation, yeah. I think we talked about the need to constantly challenge the default cultures that are around, particularly in our churches. Maybe the default culture of laziness, because it takes effort to try and keep on reaching out. We talked about how simple things about looking for the extroverts around the church, how quite often somebody on the welcome team is usually an introvert and dies a death every time they've got to go and greet or shake hands with someone. And it is about looking and finding people who've got the skill set just to connect. We also talked about the fact that you can build community online, despite, people always saying, oh no, I hate Zoom and all of that. For some, that is a really good way to build and keep on building relationship. I think, I suppose it was me picked up the point just that you'd said, John, about friendship. I remember teaching in youth work and youth ministry. What do you say after you've said hello? How do you pass on the kind of depth of conversation that you can get to? That is a wee bit different, but how do you stop that pregnant pause after you've gone up and welcomed someone and all of that? What do you do next, and how do you deepen a conversation? We talked about just the need to mess with the stereotypes, maybe as a way of addressing some of the kind of challenges that, particularly around maybe that question around young men and men generally. We've got very set notions about men's ministry, women's ministry, and often they create their own kind of stereotypes, and it's about looking to see who am I in the room with and what can we do together, and using the ordinariness of things. I'll stop there. That we don't want to start thinking about more programs, more activities, but what is ordinary? Having people for dinner, or if that's too much, invite them round for coffee and a bun. But just looking for those things that are easy to do that in neighbourhood as well as at church.
Yep, I completely agree, Linda. We're all probably loaded down with programs, but it's creating a culture of connectedness, of welcome, of interest. It's asking the question. It's seeing the opportunity to send a card to somebody, or to give them a call, or to follow up a conversation. So I completely agree with that. And that was when I was saying small things can make big differences. That was part of what I was trying to get at.
I'm Maitri. One of the things I think we also looked at, which I feel quite strongly, is that the church is very much a nuclear family structure. And also it's, you might include wider family, but the concept of inviting outsiders on a Sunday, for instance, is not an easy one because it's a family meal. And there's an Indian minister who's Anglican clergyman who was saying he's struggling to get his congregation to invite one other person for their Sunday meal. Because in India, it would be very natural that you take people home and just share whatever you had, but it's quite a structured thing. So he said he's finding it really difficult to break through that sort of sacred space of family on a Sunday. The other thing was there's a friend we have from Ghana whose husband is a minister. And she says that, the church is so involved in each other's lives that if you don't go to church, the ladies turn up at your doorstep. So she's really nervous if she doesn't go to church and doesn't have a valid reason. I think here we have such strong boundaries around our personal space and families that it's very difficult to penetrate. And maybe we can learn something from some of the other cultures, I think.
Does she someone? Oh, yes, thank you, yes.
We tried to work on the word new initiatives rather than describing things that have existed for quite a long time. So just a quick run through of things that we suggested. Focusing on eco-church, working together as trying to put in place something that would help you to get the Eco Award, would involve a lot of people within your church and possibly community, involving the local school, for instance. The idea of gardening clubs or an allotment using church ground, if that's something that is possible on your... Obviously, every church has a different situation. The warm hubs that have been introduced this past winter through grants from the council, hardship grants from the council, are great ways, and we have tried that in our own church. First few weeks, nobody turned up, not quite nobody, but very few, because I think there was a kind of a reticence that, people will think I can't afford to heat my house if I come along to this sort of thing, but it has grown into quite a good time of fellowship. Often people who are living alone, and it's just nice to come and eat their lunch with someone else. We also talked about working with local churches as part of a church forum within the council areas, and as who was saying about the grants, well, I think it was you, John, actually, churches are trusted as good users of money that's given to them. So we find that we've got quite a few grants from our local council, and indeed even the Church of Ireland have trusted us to do a mental health programme for self-care for clergy. Connecting with the missing group, people who haven't returned to church after COVID, is something we can do within our own churches, but many of the organisations that we have in individual churches are for the whole community rather than for congregations. Faith and Friendship Group, ask Ruth Patterson about that. And what was the last thing? Oh yeah, using specific reasons to have a programme, and I'm just giving this as an example, this being Mental Health Week, we have a programme of varied activities, daily walks, poetry circle, online children's stories, Bible readings, all connected with the theme of anxiety. And we got a pretty hefty grant to develop an area of the church into a community garden. So that will be opened up on...
Okay, if you mind, I'll maybe just stop you there if that's okay, because we do want to show the video. My personal big takeaway from from the three wise men who were sitting over here was, do we ever see church as being a place of fun? That's one of my takeaways of tonight. So anyway, John, do you want to introduce the video and then why you've asked for it, and then we'll play it. And then after the video, we'd like you to comment on it and pick up maybe in one of the questions.
Okay, sure. Okay, so this chap here is Ryan Karayiannis, Greek name, for Greek father. He's the youth pastor in a Christian Fellowship Church, and I'd gone off to talk to some youth leaders about why young people do not seem to be interested in what we were doing here, and had some very interesting conversations. So I asked him if he would speak a little bit to the issue of loneliness with young people, and he said, absolutely, I'd love to do that, because this is a big deal now with what we're trying to do with young people. So this is Ryan Karayiannis, and this is a short clip on Gen Zs and loneliness.
So when you then look at culture, I think it's interesting to note some of the research that's coming out. Phil Zimbardo writes a book called The Demise of Guys, where he looks at the impact of pornography and social media on young boys growing up. And he writes something really alarming. He says, in the minority of cases, it used to be that young boys would grow up without a father in the home. Now that is actually 1 in 3 boys grow up without a father in the home. But more alarmingly, he writes that the boys that grow up with a father, on average, the father and son will spend 30 minutes of personal conversation every single week. So 30 minutes time, the father will actually speak with his son, and they will engage in close proximity relationship conversation. In that same week, that young boy will spend 44 hours in a digital world. So 30 minutes, one-on-one conversation with his father, in that same week will spend 44 hours in a digital world. So interaction is literally changing on a day-to-day basis. If you think about this in a practical sense, when I used to want to hang out with my friends, I would call the landline. Everybody would have a landline in their house. I would call the landline. The parents of my friend would answer the phone, and you would have a conversation with the parents. They would then go and get your friend, you would speak with your friend, you would set up plans, make plans, and then you would arrange to meet up and go out. That's no longer the case. Interaction and connection is direct, not even with words anymore. When you have apps like Snapchat and TikTok, it's just videos and pictures. It's not even communication, words, anything like that. So interaction and relationship is changing regularly. Not only that, but the idea of connecting has changed. So my wife and I did long distance when we were dating a number of years ago. We used FaceTime to connect a lot. It was one of the greatest gifts that our phones and social media can give us today. We're now married, live in the same house, see each other every single day. But if our relationship was only through FaceTime, you would say there's something wrong with his marriage. If we only ever connected through FaceTime and never were in the same room together, you would say there's something wrong there, something's not quite right. But that actually captures a lot of what we're seeing in relationships today. You will put a group of young adults or teenagers into the same room. They will not even greet each other. They will just go immediately on their phones and sit in silence together, but could be connecting through playing a game together. That's not just for young people and young adults. That's also what you're starting to see with adults as well. When you go for dinner, majority of people will sit around a table on their phones and can be sharing things, but conversation is not eyes up looking at each other. It's completely changing how we interact. So the result of this cultural movement, in comparison to what I shared about what the framework we have for relationship, is that when you look at research on Gen Z, which is anybody born from around 1997 to 2015, so most youth groups with that generation of young people, the two main aspects, if you were a youth pastor, you used to address would be things like relationship. So you would be having a sex talk with people, you would be trying to help them navigate boundaries in relationship, and you would be looking at things like alcohol consumption. That's two of the main things if you're a youth pastor or a youth worker, you would have to navigate for previous generations. But for Gen Z, they are actually consuming less alcohol than any generation before them. And there are less teenage pregnancies than any generation before them as well. Why is this? Because relationship and interaction is completely changing, where you will literally see the majority of teenage boys will be sitting in their room on a Saturday night with a headset on, playing a video game, and would much rather do that than go to the likes of the cinema with their friends on a Saturday night. So the idea of interaction and friendship is completely changing for people. So this then results in two main things. when you talk about community, so when you say something like God says it's not good for man to be alone, the majority of Gen Z, Gen X and millennials will actually not understand what you are trying to say when you say community, because they would have a different understanding of what community and friendship actually means. The other thing is that loneliness is becoming the normative. So what once was good, when you say to somebody, let's meet up for a coffee, that makes them feel deeply uncomfortable. So you then start to feel like, well, I don't want to make somebody feel uncomfortable. Why am I receiving hesitancy? If we just keep people comfortable, then that's okay. Keep them in their bubble. But actually what once was good actually now makes people feel uncomfortable. So just to even be aware of that in ministry, to understand that is so, so important. When you're meeting with people and bringing people in for the likes of a prayer meeting, or even in a response after a service, or even in a one-on-one conversation, you're going to see higher levels of social anxiety because interaction and friendship is completely changing. So I just want to share then what we as a church are trying to do and what I am trying to look at doing in terms of resolution. How do we engage then with Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, as well as the impact on further generations that are being impacted by culture as well? What's the resolution that we have? The first thing is this. We have said that teaching isn't going to work for this generation. Teaching is one of the greatest gifts, preaching and teaching, that we can give, and we have to communicate and help them understand God's story, biblical truth, biblical worldview. But we actually have to go above and beyond that now to actually invite them into life together. When Paul is articulating this, he does it twice. In 1 Corinthians 11:1, he says this, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Basically what he's saying is, come into my life and you will get to know Jesus. If he said that on a day-to-day basis in Northern Ireland now, most people would think he was overly arrogant. But what he's basically saying is, if you want to get to know Jesus, come and do life with me. That's what we are recognizing. This generation, these generations actually require an invitation into life together. Actually to catch community. What's caught, not taught. To actually go, I am experiencing something right now that I want, that I actually don't need my phone for. That actually, this is what true community is. So then when they hear it taught on, they go, oh, I understand what that is now. But if we are just teaching community and saying to people, you need to get into community, you need to get into friendship, the whole concept of that is completely different for these generations. So we actually want to help them experience it and understand it. The second way Paul refers to it is in 1 Thessalonians 2:8. He says, we loved you so much, we didn't just share the gospel with you, we shared our lives as well. So there is an invitation into life together to say, how do we help people catch community? Whereas we are teaching community, they may have a completely different understanding of what that is. The second thing is intergenerational. Rather than creating our young adults to be something that is a separate entity altogether and just gather a large group of young adults, we want to see our church become an intergenerational community on all teams, all services, all spaces. Why is that? Because actually Ruth Perrin recently did research into that, where you'll have access to your podcast, where she understood that most millennials, Gen X and Gen Z want friendship with generations further beyond them. That is their resolution for loneliness. They are saying, we want friendship to help you unlock the problems of our generation. Now, the issue with that is most generations that are ahead of them will go, well, we don't actually think they want to hang out with us. Why would they want to spend time with us? And that's the issue we are trying to resolve. We're trying to say to people and identify them as young adult parents to say, if you can come alongside in organic relationship, just spending time with them, getting to know them, and we can bridge the gap between generations, this is actually what these younger generations are craving. Despite their lack of understanding of community and friendship, they are wanting relationship with those who are further on because they feel safer with them than their own generation. So we are saying, caught not taught, giving these people an experience of community, inviting them into life together, an intergenerational community, or two of the resolutions we are looking to give and help our community as they navigate a growing lonely culture, that we hope to give them the resolution of Jesus in this.
Okay, so I think there is a real challenge there. The first thing is, I mean, it goes back to Helen's question, what do we do about young people? Actually, when you think about it, in terms of intergenerational contexts, the church is the best intergenerational context that there is in our society. Nowhere else has that range of ages, backgrounds, all mixed up together. So we uniquely have a petri dish where intergenerational activity can take place. Now, it doesn't always do it, and I was really amazed listening to that. But another youth worker told me exactly the same. I felt, when it comes to young people, I think, nobody will want to know me. And anyway, I'll be so boring, they won't understand what I'm talking about. But actually they said, all they want is for you to take an interest in them. I mean, I don't have to get down and dirty with them. I don't have to have all the lingo. If I just ask, well, how'd the exams go? What are you going to do next year? Or how'd your holidays go? And just ask questions. And that's what they're looking for. They're looking for us to take an interest in them. I've been trying it out in church over the past few months, and it is surprising how after a while they'll come up and stand beside you. You sort of think, what do you want? And you realize that they are connecting. They're wanting to talk a bit and to have a bit more connection. So I think that's an opportunity and a challenge for us to realize. And we don't have to know all the lingo. We don't have to understand the difference between Snapchat and TikTok. We don't need to be great on devices. We just need to be interested and take an interest and be a safe person and care about them. So there we are. Anybody else want to make a comment before we finish? I found that really, really revealing, when you talked about that.
Yeah, John, it's just really picking up what you said there. I've been doing a wee bit of work over the past years with something called Fresh Expressions of Church. And one of the things that was coming across again and again, and this may relate to the generational difference, is say over something we would term discipleship. There's often a thought from one culture, this is a program, it's communication, it's points of belief. But what was coming across was the importance of what it meant to be, say, following a rabbi at the time of Jesus, in that you were with the person 24/7. And the aim was to, in that relationship, you began to see the world through their eyes, rather than being specifically taught specific facts. And it went back to this idea of the truth being relational. I am rather than propositions about the truth.
Okay, let's pray as we finish. Our Father, we do want to thank you for bringing us here this evening. We want to thank you for what you have done in us individually, but we also want to thank you for the fellowship of God's people into which you have placed all of us. And we long that the Church of Jesus Christ in this land really will be a blessing to the whole of society. And we do want to pray for the outworking of what we have heard about this evening and thought about, the challenges that have been brought both by John and Ryan. We pray, Lord, that you will deliver us from simply taking them in for ourselves, but that you will give us the courage and the capacity and the ability and the ideas to take what we have learned, what you have put on our hearts, to take it into our church fellowships and indeed into our families, into wider community. We are very grateful for the privilege of meeting together, and in such a troubled world, we do not take that for granted. So thank you for the evenings that we have had during the year, and we entrust ourselves to you individually and together for today, for this week, and for the weeks and months that you will give us ahead. In Jesus' name.